that our own lives are absolute, literal representations. The circumstances of our lives are literal representations of what is in our mind. And you start to blur the boundaries, just like the Hindu spiritual philosophers did many centuries ago. You start to blur the boundaries between what is you and what is not you. And the further you look into that, the further you contemplate that idea, the truer it becomes that there is no necessary distinction between the two. And it's very easy to say we're all one and there's this oneness and everybody dances about saying that. Very few people realize the implications of that and what that means. Because what it means, amongst other things, is that everything you do has a profound effect on everything around you. Not just your friends and family, not just the people in your immediate environment, but the whole ecosystem of conscious entities in this universe, which is vast and hugely cohesive. So it's a little bit like putting something on the internet that is very, very juicy. Within a very small amount of time, millions and millions and millions of people can share in that. You know, just like an interesting video on YouTube that sort of tickles the imagination, tickles the fancy. Suddenly, like 50 million people have watched it. It's the same thing as that, because our connectedness is so deep, far deeper, far truer than any silicon-based communication could ever be. Because it happens in a fourth dimensional space, then what we do has a massive effect on everything around us. And that's where responsibility comes into this. So not only a willingness to transform, but you cannot move into a higher dimensional consciousness. You cannot increase the frequency of your consciousness, just like electromagnetic frequencies increase. You can't do that without the responsibility of understanding what your actions are. So there is necessarily a kind of threshold, an initiatory gateway that the universe puts in place to say we can't just have any Tom, Dick and Harry doing this. It's got to be someone who is disciplined, who is focused, and who understands the implications of it. And that's a life's work, many lives' work. So it's something that we approach as you would approach a sacred building. You approach it with a certain amount of reverence, but also a certain amount of excitement as well.
Well, that's a wonderful explanation. And you've mentioned different dimensions as we've gotten along. So I do want to give you the chance to talk about the different dimensions, because, again, people have difficulty understanding typically what different dimensions really represent. So I know that you have a 7-dimensional model. Could you begin talking about that?
Yeah, sure. Of course, in the Victorian era, a lot of people made contact with mysticism for the first time because of reading and literacy and so on from the Industrial Revolution onwards, which spread from Britain to Europe to America to Asia and the rest of the world. Along with that Industrial Revolution came literacy. So before the 18th century, very, very few people could read or write. So we have a problem there, because it means that a lot of our sacred knowledge was in the hands of an extraordinary minority of people. And they were usually clerics, usually priests, Catholics, Muslims, Christians, Jews, whatever. And when you start to trace the origins of that back, you realize this is a kind of sideways answer to your question, but I will answer that question shortly. You start to realize when you look at that despite the artifice of Christianity and Catholicism and Judaism as the sort of chief Western religions, and of course the Muslim traditions in the Middle East and so on, you realize when you trace those back that when you push through all the kind of guff and all the nonsense and all the dogma and all the doctrine, there is actually something really important in a lot of those religions, but they themselves, in my view, have become disconnected from it. You push back to about 500 BC to the Alexandrian schools, then you push a little further back to 300 BC to Greece, to some of the Hebrew traditions of that time as well. And when you push further back, a lot of these things come from Egypt, and then slightly before them from Sumer. And of course, people may realize that the modern location of ancient Sumer, of the Sumerian culture, is Iraq, essentially. And so a lot of our knowledge about the realms and the dimensions and the densities, the earliest written tracings of that, directly affecting Christianity, for example, come from Iraq around 3,500 BC, maybe earlier. I'm being conservative there, maybe 4,500 BC. And they were talking about dimensions and realms, and their gods, Anu and Enki, and the Egyptian Thoth, and also Hermes, who is said to have instructed Abraham, for example, who was the forefather of all the Abrahamic religions, naturally, talked of these worlds, talked of these realms, of these spheres of existence, and they were mapped out to be 9 or 12 or 5 or 6 or 7. And I basically say, well, we don't know really until you ascend through them and we map them ourselves, but let us say that there are 7, because that...
So, Neil, I'm just going to hold you right there because we're up at our last break, and it's a perfect time to break just before you begin the explanation. This is Peter Tung for Awakening to Conscious Co-Creation.
Taking you to the threshold of a dream and beyond. Seventh Wave Network.
Do you want to reach your highest potential in your personal and business life? Come and join our heart-centered community with Peter Tung and Sherry Chase. Embrace love, abundance, integrity, and personal empowerment in a safe and sacred space for your awakening. Our intention is to lay the groundwork for you to advance your awareness sufficiently to be fully involved in the conscious co-creation of peace and prosperity on our beautiful planet. Go to myheartcenteredjourney.com for more information.
Be extraordinary. Seventh Wave Network.
You're listening to Awakening to Conscious Co-Creation with Peter Tung. If you have a question for Peter or comment on this series, please send an email to descendingdove@gmail.com. That's descendingdove@gmail.com. Now back to our program.
Welcome back to Awakening to Conscious Co-Creation with your host, Peter Tung. Having an absolutely wonderful and powerful talk today with Neil Kramer, who's given us an explanation of life, essentially. And he's just about to go into the 7-dimensional realms. But before you do, Neil, just remind us of your website so people can connect with you after the show.
Sure. My website is neilkramer.com, and essentially all my work is accessible from there.
And that's neilkramer.com.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, back to the 7 dimensions.
Okay, so yes, we were talking just before the break of the origins of this knowledge, and I was drawing people's attention to the fact, which is pretty kind of indisputable really, that a lot of the religions that we have today stem from a single source, in my view. And you can go back before Sumer to ancient indigenous shamanic European people and say, well, where did they get that from? And there's this lineage, there's this knowledge. And my view has always been, and I'm discussing this in my forthcoming book, which is out in the spring, but my view has always been that there is one sacred knowledge, there is one system and set of tools and strategies and observations and truths that describe the mechanics of this universe and of this process in a very transcendent way and in a very multidimensional way. So you cannot really rely on any modern religious tradition or spiritual tradition. You have to go back to understand its heritage. And when you do, you realize that a fundamental part of that observation from those early traditions is the idea that there are a number of nested dimensions, we would call them nowadays. In the old tongue, they would call them spheres or realms or planes or astral levels and all these different words. And those words usually sort of resonate with the cultural expectations and the linguistics and the syntax and so on of the time. Nowadays,